Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Gulf International Forum's discussion today on 5 years of civil war in Yemen and where it will go. Early note: aside from the fact that they invented this technology 40 years too late for me, I greatly regret that I will not have the opportunity to interact much with our scores of guests. God willing, we'll get back to a more normal human condition as soon as safety permits. Mark Twain once famously said, "History does not repeat itself, but it often rhymes." Today's topic raises some eerie memories for me. I went to my first Foreign Service assignment in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, in December 1963. I arrived as the so-called North Yemen Civil War entered its second year. Rhyming applies to today's topic very much. In a revolutionary movement intervened. Sorry, I'm still trying to make this work. A revolutionary movement overthrew an established autocrat in 1962. A major neighboring power intervened in 1962 to help the revolution. Another power in the neighborhood intervened to restore the status quo. The two intervening powers used Yemen to conduct a proxy war over a much bigger competition between the two. Between 1962 and 1967, Saudi Arabia and Egypt fought a proxy war over the rubble in Yemen. The United States and the United Kingdom supported Saudi Arabia, and the U.S. stationed a fighter squadron in the kingdom to protect it against Egypt. Today, Iran and Saudi Arabia fight a proxy war over the rubble of Yemen, and American forces have deployed to the kingdom to protect it against Iran. The United States and the United Kingdom, again, are providing the arsenal for Saudi Arabia. For the average Yemeni citizen, nothing much else has changed. Thousands have died and millions have suffered as their neighbors devastate their country in order to gain regional leadership. And perhaps today it will end as it ended in 1967 with the Black Swan event, unconnected to the clash between the regional rivals. In 1967, Israel's attack on Egypt gave Cairo the cover to withdraw from Yemen after 5 years of a costly and unpopular intervention. Today, it appears that a frightening microbe may give Riyadh that same cover. As usual, Mark Twain was on to something. Today, in the 5th year of a dreadful war that has reduced Yemen to the worst humanitarian disaster on the globe, we have assembled a panel of experts with a deep interest and great in the plight of that unhappy country to discuss how it can rise again, phoenix-like from the ashes. You can find their biographies on the announcement through which you signed up for this event, so I won't take up your valuable time reading them again. Samuel Ramani will discuss the international aspects of the conflict. David Roches will give us his usual clinical analysis of the military balance and how things might play out under different scenarios. And Rasha Jarhum, will look at how the war has affected the lives of Yemen's people and what it portends for the future. Dr. Nabeel Khoury will, and I need the sequence again, will give us the status of the coalition after 5 years of war. What is and where things are going and how this may end. So we can go on with this now. May I please turn this over to Mr. Samuel Ramani.
Okay, so is that ready now? Yeah. Okay, so thank you very much for the opportunity to present today on the war in Yemen at the Gulf International Forum by Zoom. And thank you, Ambassador Theros, for your insightful contextual comments. It's really great to be here and to kickstart this excellent panel. In my talk today, I'm going to provide an overall layout of where things are in Yemen at this perilous time in the conflict, focusing on the international dimensions. We are 5 years into the war and 16 months after the Stockholm Agreement, which called for peace in Hodeidah between the Houthis and the Yemeni government forces. Yet the situation remains, and arguably is almost an acute crisis as ever. The Stockholm Agreement succeeded in staving off an immediate humanitarian crisis, a famine that would have resulted from a prolonged battle for control over a vital supply line on the Red Sea. but it ultimately proved to be a one-dimensional peace initiative that did not lead to a lasting nationwide peace, but rather only an ephemeral de-escalation in one particular city. Cross-border attacks by the Houthis against Saudi economic infrastructure have become more frequent. In return, the Saudis have launched airstrikes against Houthi targets. But these airstrikes have critically not deterred the expansion of Houthi influence in Al-Jaf and their aggression in Marib. The Houthis have also periodically made advances in southern Yemen through missile strikes in Al-Ale, though their influence remains peripheral there, as the primary geopolitical struggle remains between the UAE-aligned STC and Hadi government-aligned militias in control of Aden and the surrounding area. So what explains this very dire situation in Yemen, in spite of all the optimism and hope about peace that has periodically surfaced? Just in November, UN Special Envoy Martin Griffiths said that there was an 80% reduction in Saudi airstrikes, and this was likely going to lead to a potential de-escalation in the near future. But that clearly did not happen. I think that there's three things I would like to take away from in terms of the reasons for the escalations and the continued war. First of all, Saudi Arabia and the Houthis are locked in a mutually destructive cyclical spiral of violence. What do I mean by that? Saudi Arabia at the present time is very keen to withdraw from the Yemen war, and in fact has many compelling reasons to do that. Its principal ally, the United Arab Emirates, formally completed its drawdown in February, has been steadily withdrawing its presence before that from at least early July, if not earlier. Sudanese soldiers, which bore the brunt of the Saudi military intervention on the front lines, have scaled back their presence. The war in Yemen has damaged Saudi Arabia's reputation internationally at a time when their economy is in crisis due to low oil prices and the uncertainty surrounding COVID-19. Moreover, Saudi Arabia is facing acute international isolation and criticism for its conduct in Yemen. Its relationship with the U.S. Congress is at arguably an all-time low in recent memory due to the aftermath of the Khashoggi affair, with even prominent Republicans like Lindsey Graham opposing arms sales to Saudi Arabia. In Europe, countries like Germany have really reduced their arms sales to the Saudis, and now that Turkey and to some degree the UAE have patched up their differences with some European countries, Saudi Arabia is more exposed than before. Even China is desperate to see stability in Yemen because it wants to expand its Belt and Road on the Red Sea. So Saudi Arabia has a clear international pressure and domestic imperative to continue. But Mohammed bin Salman is struggling to withdraw and is unable to withdraw because his credibility and his legitimacy is so inextricably linked with this war. A war that's cost about $200 million a day by any estimate. So one of the things that I think is really driving the continuation of Saudi airstrikes is the fear that they'll end the war 5 years later in a worse off position than where they began. With the Houthis taking over Al-Jaf, with the Houthis pushing for the oil-rich region of Marib, and with Aden under Hadi government control but still facing contestation from the STC, it's very possible that the Houthis could end the war in almost a stronger position than where they began, and Saudi Arabia could end the war much weaker. And that would be a tremendous loss of face for the Crown Prince. So Saudi Arabia has been trapped into something of a destructive cycle of isolation. That's the first part of the self-perpetuating and tragic cycle. The cycle is enabled further by the fact that the Houthis and the Iranians are sensing Saudi vulnerability. The Iranians opposed the Riyadh agreement in November and claimed that it would lead to a Saudi occupation of northern Yemen and an Emirati occupation of the south. The Houthis have arguably transitioned from being sectarian allies of Iran to a much deeper proxy relationship, in spite of Iran's dwindling resources and Soleimani's death, which doesn't seem to have deterred Iranian conduct in Yemen at all. The Iranians are keen in the long term to gain a sphere of influence in the Bab el-Mandeb Strait and a permanent check on Saudi borders that could contain what they see as Saudi Arabia's undue interference in their sphere of influence, Iraq and Lebanon. So ultimately, the Houthis are capitalizing on Saudi weaknesses and Saudi vulnerabilities by launching missile strikes and continuing to escalate the conflict. The Saudis are retaliating with airstrikes in civilian areas, prompting a mutually destructive spiral of escalation that nobody can seem to get out of. That cycle is what needs to be broken to achieve a lasting peace. Secondly, there is a problem with the decentralization of the peace process and, in general, deep distrust of multilateral institutions, in particular the United Nations. All three major factions in the past several months have expressed serious grievances with the conduct of UN Special Envoy Martin Griffiths. McLaughlin, who was a senior advisor to Hadi last week, showed concerns that Griffiths was not paying enough attention to the Houthi escalations in Marib. Similarly, Iranian state media outlets, particularly in the Persian language, have gone on a scathing attack against Martin Griffiths, accusing him of silence over the Saudi airstrikes and of continuing to enforce UN sanctions against the Houthis that cripple Yemen's humanitarian situation. The SDC have lamented their continued exclusion from the formal peace process in spite of the Riyadh agreement. So when Martin Griffiths calls for peace like he did in November talking about the airstrikes, no one seems to listen. No one seems to care. Outside mediators who claim to have acted as potential supporters of the peace process have also failed to achieve a lasting de-escalation. The European E4 format, which is France, Germany, France, and Italy, have tried to make outreaches to resolve the war. They went to Iran, for example, in August of 2019, but these outreaches overall have not changed Houthi conduct or really contributed to Iran becoming a constructive player in the conflict. Russia, which is staking out a diplomatic claim to be a balancer of all hostile powers in the Middle East, has not extended its dialogue facilitation initiatives from Syria and Libya to Yemen, and even if it did, its prior track record suggests that it wouldn't be too effective either. Qatar has had moments of effectiveness in the past, during the Saleh era, but the Gulf crisis and the fact that it's seen as pro-Islam or pro-Houthi, or even pro-Al-Qaeda by some elements of the Yemeni coalition, means that it's been marginalized as a potential mediator. Other regional mediators that have proven to be active in the current conflict have also struggled. Oman and Kuwait in particular. Kuwait's facing the legacy of the failed 2016 talks, whereas Oman, which is the only regional power that can genuinely engage with all sides, is undergoing the turmoil of a leadership transition from Sultan Qaboos to Sultan Haytham, and arguably the worst economic outlook of any of the Gulf monarchies, if the current IMF projections are to be believed. So there's a weakness and lack of credibility about the UN process, and no other assistance or international players are stepping up to challenge this. There's in general a vacuum of leadership that's undermining the peace process, as well as the spiral of escalation that I noted earlier. Thirdly, the international community is polarized and divided, and there's no clarity about what an acceptable outcome in Yemen can look like. In December, Hadi stated that federalism was his preference, but we don't know what federalism means. Does it mean a north-south division with South Yemeni autonomy? Unity is an insistence from the Hadi point of view, so the best case they could go for is autonomy. But that would contradict the Riyadh Agreement's power-sharing model. If we go in a more decentralized manner, and we indulge regional separatisms in Hadramut and others, we could end up with half a dozen proto-states that could divide Yemen further and lead to multiple inter-regional civil wars inside the current one. So, and also the deep distrust amongst various factions makes it very difficult for them to come to the bargaining table. With the SEC claiming that Islam and the Houthis are aligned together, the Houthis stoking Yemeni nationalism against Hadi continuing to politicize COVID-19 with regards to the Houthis, claiming that they want to kill instead of quarantine patients, and that they're seizing medical aid for their own benefit, it's abundantly clear that sectarianism, tribalism, and distrust continue to prevent an acceptable outcome. And the international community is powerless because it really lacks a vision for what federalism is. Finally, the adherence to UN Resolution 2216 continues to obstruct the conflict. The UAE doesn't really recognize it that seriously because it wants Hadi to be replaced, but the regime structures to remain intact. Iran and Russia largely oppose it. It seems to be only the Saudis, and to some degree the Americans and the British and some others, who view it as a makeshift solution, but even they acknowledge that it's not going to be the foundations for a lasting peace, but nothing in terms of an alternative has stepped up. So we have a situation right now where there's something of a paradox in Yemen. Most of the major actors in the conflict have genuine interest in peace. Saudi Arabia because it wants to withdraw, the West because it wants to detach itself from the world's worst humanitarian crisis, China because it wants to invest in the reconstruction, Russia because it wants to bolster its image as a geopolitical player in the region, and even Iran, in a narrow sense, those capitalizing on Houthi expansionism, could offer de-escalation if it had a window of normalization with Europe. But in spite of the desires of all international stakeholders to perhaps withdraw, and the COVID-19 crisis, the continuing distrust, the lack of leadership in the peace process, and the spiral of escalation is preventing those wishes from coming to fruition. We need a clear framework for peace, clarity, and centralization for this to be achieved in the near to long term. So that's my remarks. Now we can proceed to the next speaker.
I've been asked to address one very, very narrow portion of the military aspects of the conflict, and that is American military support, which I've broadened to be Western military support for Saudi Arabia and Yemen. I can talk about military aspects of the Yemen conflict ad infinitum, but in a war that's seen immeasurable cruelty, it seems that there's no point in me piling on to that level of cruelty. So if you'd like to ask in the questions, I'd be happy to delve into other aspects. There are 4 wars going on in Yemen right now, arguably 5. So this is just one narrow aspect. I do have to point out at the onset that my remarks do not reflect the U.S. government. So first, let's talk about past support, which is no longer continuing. And there have been 2 major aspects that have been focused on. The first is air-to-air refueling. This picture shows a Saudi plane providing air-to-air refueling to both Saudi F-15s and American F-15s. In the past, the United States has done this. We did it under what's called an acquisition cross-servicing agreement, which was basically a swap where we would provide them equipment to be reimbursed later on, in this instance, fuel. It's emerged, this was a little bit of a mini scandal because it emerged that when we were providing this, we weren't keeping accurate records and we weren't debiting the Saudi account. So that's being worked on. And then the bottom shows a Saudi pilot in the cockpit of an F-15. We have provided other elements of support, such as air-to-sea rescue in the early days of the air campaign. When a F-15 crew had to bail in the Red Sea, the United States extracted those pilots, and that obviously was appreciated. I think that if such an incident were to happen again, and we did have assets in the region, we would provide this, but not as a matter of course, not as a matter of policy, rather as an exception. That has been scaled back. So let's talk about what we're doing now. Next slide, please. So, of course, current support focuses on the provision of munitions, and this continues to go on. Of course, the picture at the bottom, which shows the JDAM, this is a precision-guided munition, but the full suite of munitions, not just in air-to-ground, although that has drawn the most public attention, but also ground-to-ground and air defense, things such as Patriot missile system parts, things such as parts for various armored vehicles, ammunition, artillery rounds. Now, the United States is not the only provider of these. It's worth noting, for example, that the Chinese have recently provided 155 millimeter howitzers and ammunition to both the Saudis and the Emiratis for use in Yemen. And my assessment of that is that this reflects a desire to broaden supporters should there be some sort of a hold on weapons support to ensure that they have a constant stream of weapons, because 155 millimeter howitzers is pretty much standard military equipment. It's not high tech. But the focus has been on this legislatively as well as in public opinion. It's worth noting here that the coalition forces, particularly air forces, have exceeded expectations. You know, when one reads Army of Sand and a lot of the current writing on Arab militaries, at the outset in 2015, the general consensus of informed Western opinion, and I use that ironically, you can't see me, but I'm making air quotes, was that the militaries of the coalition would be stretched to maintain their forces in the field for longer than a period of several months. And the fact that the Emirati and Saudi Air Forces have been able to continue operations for 5 years under pretty trying logistical circumstances, that exceeds expectations. That's something that most people thought would have been beyond the ability of them to sustain, that it would have overtaxed logistics systems, particularly when you consider the Saudi burden of doing that while at the same time trying to maintain an active deterrent provision of forces, not just across the Gulf towards Iran, but also increasingly towards the north as the Hezbollah in Iraq has acquired missiles. So speaking from a military and logistics standpoint, which is my professional bias, it has been impressive that these forces have been able to operate in the field, irrespective of the lack or absence of tactical and operational success on the ground. Next slide, please. This shows one of the main considerations, which is, of course, the transmission of missiles from Iran to Yemen to be used against Saudi Arabia. And one of the major American forces here has been the provision of air defense equipment. Initially, there was a foreign military sales acquisition of Patriot missiles. This was augmented by direct commercial sales of Patriot. I believe that's the first time there's been a direct commercial sales of Patriot. The Saudi armed forces are very Patriot intense, and they have a very impressive record of intercepts. They have shot down over 100 missiles in various aspects. But of course, there is a popular misconception as to what the abilities, limits, and capabilities of these missile intercept systems are. They're designed to intercept ballistic missiles only within a certain area. And unfortunately, people tend to view, once you have air defense, they think it's as if you've dropped a dome over an entire city, like in the Simpsons movie, and that prevents everything in there. What you are able to do is to protect certain points from that. And that has been impressive, and that has been the focus of sustained support from not just American military circles, but also American industry. Next slide, please. This shows the threat. The key threat elements are the Qiyam missile, which is right in the middle. That has been sawed in half, put into shipping containers, and transshipped from Iran to Yemen, where it is then welded together, painted blue, and redesignated as the Burkan missile. These were the missiles that were launched at Riyadh International Airport and the Royal Palace compound in 2017. And then the most recent missile attack on Riyadh was the Zulfiqar missile, which is about 40% of the way over from the left, 35% of the way over from the left. That Zulfiqar is quickly emerging as the workhorse of the Iranian missile fleet. We've also seen it used in Iran, against targets in Iraq, to include, we think that this was what was used at the Taji Air Base in that tit-for-tat cycle we saw. This is, okay, next slide. This is a Patriot missile battery firing unit, and it looks like it's in western Riyadh. This is the PAC-2 Patriot. Recently, we've seen that the PAC-3 Patriot has also been used in the interception of the Zulfiqar missiles that were fired at Riyadh last month. This is a major, major effort. And the Royal Saudi Air Defense Forces, which are a separate military service on par with the Army, Navy, and Air Force, they are the most competent branch of the Saudi armed forces, and their connection with the American industry in the form of Lockheed Martin, which has PAC-3, in the form of Raytheon, which has PAC-2 and also produces the radars for this and for THAAD missile, is profound, ongoing, strong, and is quite frankly impressive. It's the most impressive part of the performance, and it stands in direct contrast to the lack of success we've seen on the ground and the lack of strategic and operational success from the air-to-ground campaign. Next slide, please. So I've alluded to this lack of operational success. So this map shows more or less the reach of Houthi control. Initially, the Houthis were able to break out of their homeland in Sadda to the north, primarily by the treachery of Ali Abdullah Saleh, who basically retained control over most of the security apparatus of the Yemeni state, even after he was removed from office, and handed that over. Of course, Saleh switched sides and met his death at the hands of the Houthis, trying to quadruple cross the people that he had originally double-crossed his former vice president Hadi with. Recently, if you look up in the north, right around the Y in Yemen, Houthi advances on the ground into Jauf province and Marib province have been pretty significant, and it looks as though the Houthis are on the verge of taking pretty much every target of significance in northern Yemen, every population center. Although when one deals with Yemen, it is always risky to speak of broad units. As we know, the tribal faction is very large. As Samuel has spoken, the possibility of multiple forces in multiple civil wars, that is a very real possibility in Yemen. But that seems to be part of the impetus for doing this. And what we attribute this to here in the West is the fact that while the Saudi strategy seems to be one, if you can call it strategy, seems to be one of shock and awe. This is what they embarked on in 2015. And the problem is, if that doesn't succeed initially, then you're not left with very many good options. And of course, the Saudis have chosen to prosecute the war on the ground primarily through proxy forces who are notoriously unreliable when it gets to the hooking and jabbing. It's just very hard to maintain success on the ground in a ground campaign if you don't have it. This is not unique to Saudi Arabia. I would argue that the parallel is if you look at the failure of the NATO air campaign in the Kosovo War in 1999, and if you look at the limitations of the American shock and awe campaign in 2003, what you see is basically salesmanship, saying you can do everything from the air. This is the myth of air power that has existed since Giulio Duhé in 2017. That salesmanship substitutes for strategy. And if you look up my name on cspan.org, you can see publicly that I made this prediction in 2015, right after the initiation of the war, and sadly proved to be prescient. Next slide, please. So what is militarily and strategically, what is affecting Saudi Arabia? Well, there's a couple things. The picture on the top shows some of the results of the famine in Yemen. The picture on the bottom shows a bombed hospital in Yemen. Rightly or wrongly, justly or unjustly, intentionally or not, in the court of Western international opinion, which is where decisions are made on providing weapons, providing training, or withholding them, Saudi Arabia, unfortunately, for the Saudis, is being blamed for both of these. The Houthi malfeasance, which does exist, is generally downplayed. And the reason for this, I think, is just the fact that we know the Saudis, they're understandable, and their press and their image is just not good in the West. And it's a David and Goliath story, and that never goes over well. So individual instances, when you have a dynamic like this, the David Goliath, the idea that poor airmanship or misidentification of targets could lead, for example, to an attack on a hospital, that is just not accepted in the West. This is the burden the United States operates under, and this is the burden the Saudis operate under. So recall again, going back to the Kosovo War, when the United States Air Force hit the Chinese embassy in Belgrade. It was just considered to be unacceptable and unthinkable that there could have been an intelligence error or a targeting error or an airmanship error. But these things do happen. Mistakes happen in war. Unfortunately, it's sort of a perverted measure of the international consensus towards competence awarded to the Saudi Air Force, that they are now held by Western public opinion to be incapable of making an honest mistake. And so Saudi Arabia has come to be seen as responsible for the famine and for the humanitarian crisis there, in Western opinion, fairly, unfairly, justly, unjustly. Next slide, please. Of course, COVID has yet to hit Yemen in a way that has been recorded and reported. This map shows areas that are viewed to be at extreme danger. The darker blue, the more danger. And unfortunately, white doesn't mean they're okay. It just means that there's no statistics being gathered there. So basically what we're seeing is a potential disaster when this hits, piling onto the existing disaster of lack of healthcare, lack of food, lack of infrastructure. COVID has the ability to do this. And so this, together with the factors that Samuel has gone into, I think are motivating the Saudi proposals for a ceasefire and enhanced negotiations. The initial Houthi response has a list of conditions such as Saudi must pay for the restoration of all damage in the war, left unclear to include Houthi damage, which quite frankly is unacceptable. But there clearly is that. And then finally, I spoke about Western reaction to that. It's kind of hard to read, but this is the veto message that President Trump sent back to a Senate measure that would have put a curb on U.S. weapons transfers to Saudi Arabia. along with to the United Kingdom to be used in Northern Ireland. So it's important to note that this measure, which would have halted our weapons transfers to, a very important security partner, passed the House of Representatives and passed the U.S. Senate, but it did not pass with a 2/3 majority. So what we see is that there is a potential for it. Finally, this final picture shows Canadian light armored vehicles. These vehicles are on the crest of the Saudi Arabia National Guard. They're part of their heraldry. Canada, in response to the factors that I mentioned here, had held up export of military weapons to Saudi Arabia, although in the last week, recognizing a number of factors to include possibly Saudi expression of goodwill to end the conflict as shown by the Saudi ceasefire proposals, Canada lifted the hold on these weapon sales. So there is still some room there, and what we're seeing is that Western arms exporters, to include the United States, are willing to do this. But if the dynamic should shift against Saudi Arabia again, if there should be another popular thing, if COVID proves to be disastrous and Saudi Arabia is blamed for it, as I predict they will be if that event happens, or if, quite frankly, President Trump, who has made his support of Saudi Arabia so closely identified with him that it's become a partisan issue, if he were to lose the White House, then it is possible that American support and thus Western support of the Saudi armed forces will decline. I'm sorry to speak so briefly about just such a narrow portion of it, but I'll welcome your most difficult questions. Thank you.
Generally, in terms of first about our work as Peace Track Initiative, we've been very involved in supporting the peace process, mainly specifically by working with women inside Yemen and outside Yemen. We have 250 members of Women in the Women Solidarity Network in all the governorates inside Yemen, but also outside of Yemen. And we work to support the peace process in the three main diplomatic tracks. In track one, we try to support having women in the peace process itself and during the negotiations and peace consultations. If that doesn't happen within the negotiation delegations, we try to send our own women delegations who consult widely with other women groups to bring in joint messages. We also lead track 2 consultations with women groups and support both the UN-led process, but also some Saudi-led process when they do the mediation directly. So in reflection to the current peace process, we have the UN-led process and then we have the Saudi-led process. The Saudi-led process was focusing on the Riyadh agreement, basically between the South Transitional Council and the government, and also the direct negotiations with the Houthis. So starting with the Riyadh agreement, we've seen that I think there was not a lot of reliance on the UN process. The UN has always been exclusionary or focusing on two main parties, which is the government and the Houthis. And this is mainly one of the limitations of 2216 that basically limited the peace process or made it a traditional design of a two-party process. And I think Saudi Arabia had to interfere to have this separate negotiation to resolve the issues between the South Transitional Council and the government, and to unite who are supposed to be allies against the Houthis. And we've seen that the Riyadh agreement has not been implemented so far. It's too early to say it has failed, although it did not meet the time frame. I still have some hope that there will be any kind of implementation, although we see a lot of escalations in terms of preparedness to engage. And yesterday we heard in Abiyan already conflict has started to happen. For the Stockholm process that the UN led, what we have noticed is that the current envoy has started with very low standards. When he led the process in Stockholm agreement, he focused on issues that fall within confidence building, not really negotiation process over the main issues of the peace agenda. So the main focus during Stockholm was about humanitarian access, about preventing an escalation in Hodeidah, about the detainees issue, and about Ta'az. And Ta'az felt like it was an issue that was added at the last minute with like 3 points into the agreement that was not clear. It was only talking about forming a committee that has not yet, until today, has not even met once. And within the file of the detainees, we also saw that there was no progress whatsoever, although Mr. Martin Griffiths has announced that there has been agreements about a detailed plan. In his last month's briefing, he said there was a detailed plan of an agreement between the government and the Houthis to release at least, I think, around 1,400, but we haven't seen any progress in that in terms of actual release of detainees. On the contrary, what we are seeing, we are seeing increased detention. We are seeing Houthis are increasingly detaining people, although they have announced, for example, the release of Baha'is, but this announcement of their amnesty and the release has not materialized so far. Generally, there is, in the very recent effort about the ceasefire, starting with the Saudi or the Arab coalition process to have a 2 weeks renewable ceasefire, it is unilateral. Yesterday, there was news about explosions in Sana'a, and the Houthis are accusing Saudi Arabia that they have broken the ceasefire. But in my opinion, that I don't think it is accurate. We have seen before explosions in Sana'a, and the Houthis quick to blame Saudis. I think the coalition is still holding the ceasefire, and it was not smart to start bombing Sana'a before a UN Security Council session. So this needs further investigation, but generally my information and my sources are confirming that it was not the coalition who had some bombing yesterday in Sana'a. So hoping that this ceasefire is still holding. The Houthis, they welcomed the calls for ceasefire, and we've seen that they have issued the ceasefire agreement, like vision that they had. And when you go through the vision, what I've noticed first is that there is a lot of points that is resonating actually with the points proposed by the UN, especially about the attacks, cross-border attacks, and also the implementation mechanism and like the committees. There were so many points resonating, if not exact translation of what the UN envoys have been proposing. And then there is a list of other issues that they have added, which is basically a list of demands for it to happen, and it's reflecting their position since even Stockholm or since Kuwait negotiations. Nothing has changed. They still want the same thing: lifting the embargo from Yemen, opening the airport, basically all the economic file in terms of the salaries and everything. This is not a changed position of the Houthis. This has been their position since day one, and it is basically to institutionalize their legitimacy as a state actor within the part they are controlling. That's their agreement. This is what I read from their agreement. What we have, what we are worried about or concerned is that the Houthis always would look like they are engaging in a political process, but they will always continue at the ground with their military operation. They have lost the trust with the Yemeni people. Although they are showing that they are open to the peace process with this, providing this vision, still there is a lot of doubt about their true intention, because what we are seeing is more escalations in Marib, in Ta'az, in Al-Dala', in Hodeidah. So we are not seeing any kind of confidence building measures that are being taken, even at the level of freeing the detainees, which can give us an indicator that they are really serious about basically moving towards a peace process. What we know is that the Saudi-led process, specifically the mediation process with the Houthis, formally started last year, in the last quarter of last year. It was going smoothly, and it was mediated by Oman, or facilitated by Oman. But it was not between Saudis with Houthi hardliners. It was more with the spokesperson or the softliners of Houthis. And there was a question about whether a demand is about having to remain loyal to Iran, or to establish a new relation with Saudi Arabia regarding to their loyalty with Iran. I think this is where some ideas are being floated. Moving after Soleimani was killed, we had actually, during that period of negotiation between Saudis and Houthis, there was an informal ceasefire, at least a cross-border ceasefire. And after Soleimani was killed, what we have seen is that Houthis became more vicious, and they started expanding their military operations. They took over Nehm, they took over Al Jawf Governorate. Now they are working to take over Marib and Ta'az, and Dalah has been for a number of months now a heated conflict that is not even being mentioned by the UN briefings. And there is a huge humanitarian catastrophe in all these governorates. With the COVID coming into the picture, I think the COVID gave a good opportunity for all parties to have a break. And this is why I think the Saudis were eager to implement a ceasefire right now. It is the best opportunity for them to have a save the face opportunity to basically do a ceasefire. The Houthis and the government and at the local level, the national parties are still not seizing this opportunity. But I think when they start dying from COVID, maybe that's when they will become more serious about the peace prospect. I would stop here and we can address a question.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. And following on David Roche's excellent presentation, in particular those slides which detail Western support to the Arab coalition, and also the improved performance of the Arab coalition, particularly in the air war. I think the ability to do mid-air refueling in particular is something that very few countries in the world can do. So it is indeed impressive that the US was able to impart this to the Arab coalition pilots, so that they're doing it almost on their own now. However, despite all this technological superiority and improved performance, one has to conclude that the Arab coalition intervention in Yemen has failed. With all this superiority, after 5 years, they simply have not won the war. And the war continues apace. With all the uncertainties of this war, one thing is certain: it has devastated Yemen, socially, politically, and economically. And it has also destabilized the region. First of all, for Yemen, and Rasha talked about the humanitarian aspect, the disaster in Yemen is of epic proportions. This has been well established, and the fact that the world remains somewhat oblivious to this is a condemnation of the present world order with all its institutions, the United Nations envoys and all. They simply have not put the right focus, the right stress, the right pressure to bring about an end to this war. If Yemen has been devastated, what has happened to the region? The security of the region is much less now than it was at the beginning of this war. For one thing, Iran's influence in Yemen. Iran is now a factor in Yemen. much more so than it was at the beginning of the war. The southern border of Saudi Arabia is porous, and Yemeni forces are inside Saudi Arabia as we speak. They have been able to come in and out almost at will. Houthi rockets, one way or another from different directions, have been able to reach almost anywhere inside Saudi Arabia. And despite the fact that the Patriot system has worked well for the Saudis, you don't need to be able to defend against a majority and keep your safety. A few rockets landing, as we saw at the one that landed and hit the Aramco facilities, could cause grievous damage to Saudi installations. To top it all, this coronavirus now is a threat to everybody in the region. And this threat is all the more serious because of the war. The continuation of the war simply means that there cannot be effective regional collaboration in fighting this common enemy. Now, if the coalition's war on Yemen, the stated goal was to restore legitimacy in Yemen and to reestablish security and stability in the region. Clearly, this has not happened after 5 years and after all this tremendous expenditure. Now, you have to conclude, I mean, if a rational actor would not do this, would not establish a goal and then go ahead achieving the opposite, the conclusions can only be either that the decision makers in the Arab coalition are irrational, or that they are rational in the pragmatic sense, but achieving different goals from what they started out to achieve. And the goals in this case would be narrowly focused on strategic gains. The strategic gains, again, here we are discussing rationales, intelligence on the decision makers in Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. It has never been good. And so we are left to speculate. But it has been well established that the Emirates has long been interested in acquiring seaports in Yemen. And this war has achieved via proxy forces, the Nukhba forces primarily, and the STC, the Southern Transitional Council. Through them, Aden is under UAE control, and so is Socotra. So, they would have liked to add Hodeidah to it, but that seems far-fetched at this point. Still, I mean, in terms of rationality, if that was their goal, then pretty much they have achieved it. For Saudi Arabia, again, it has long been established their interest in the Hadramaut and the Mahara regions for various cultural, political reasons, as well as economic and strategic. The Saudi forces in Mahara, with their intelligence officers there, can monitor the Omani border. So in terms of security, that achieves something for Saudi Arabia. In addition, they have long been interested in extending a pipeline from their eastern oil wells down through Yemen to the Indian Ocean. That is something that they first proposed to Ali Abdullah Saleh in 2005 and 6, and it didn't work out as a deal between them. With their influence directly in Mahara and indirectly through forces that are still loyal to Hadi in the Hadramaut, they can do that. They can start planning that. At least this, again, is rational, not in the moral sense but in the de facto realpolitik sense. Now, what worries me about this, two things. One, I think there may be a pragmatic move from a ceasefire to some kind of a formal or informal understanding that a division of Yemen, as current forces more or less are strategically placed, would leave the Houthis in control of most of the north of Yemen. And as they've said, the extension of Houthi control to Marib, which is not complete yet, but moving ahead, and to Jawf, would give the Houthis a defensible and economically viable region. The Saudis could be satisfied with a no hostilities agreement between them and the Houthis in Yemen, provided they keep control of the two corridors that I mentioned that they wanted. And as far as the Emirates are concerned, they've already withdrawn their forces. They do not wish to have direct control, but indirectly, through proxy forces, they would be satisfied in having control of and use of Aden as well as Socotra. This arrangement would not be stable, even if it were acceptable to most of the warring parties. It leaves certain regions that will continue to be contested, such as Hodeidah, such as Taiz and Dala. In addition, the tribal arrangements would never be quite comfortable with this. I think in Mahara, for example, there is a resistance to Saudi presence. On Socotra Island, there is also a resistance to either foreign presence or proxy presence, for that matter. And so this will not give permanent peace to the region, and it will continue to be a region that is open to meddling by outside forces, whether Iran or other forces would continue to play in this. Now, what is needed now, I mean, I think the UN envoy, and he only today in his briefing to the UNSC an hour earlier, did he call for a full comprehensive ceasefire. He wasted a lot of time earlier, focused on narrow issues as important as they are. They did not really hit at the crux of the problem. He is now working for a comprehensive ceasefire, using the urgency of the need to confront the coronavirus. But unless the UNSC unanimously not only supports this call, but also places resources, primarily diplomatic and economic, to enforce or to really pressure all the parties to bring about a comprehensive peace. Unless they're willing to do that, then Martin Griffiths and Gutierrez can call for peace all that they want, and it would not have an impact. Let's wait and see when the Security Council meets to see if there is a renewed will now for the big powers to really intervene and put their weight behind a call for a ceasefire. Internally, I think, I see a division, a de facto division of Yemen currently existing, and probably for the immediate and midterm future, that's what we're going to see in Yemen. I don't see a reunification of Yemen anytime soon, but whether reunified as a single state or as a federal state, peaceably working with the different parts of Yemen, what you need is strong national leadership to bring this about. The country has been now fragmented and at war with itself for at least the past 5 years. And President Hadi has been a very ineffective leader, to say the least. You need new leadership at this, within this, or under the umbrella of the legitimacy government. And there are Yemenis inside Yemen and outside of Yemen, men and women, who are learned, understand the world, and are perfectly capable of becoming national leaders. Those people need to be encouraged because the current government has failed, and I don't see any prospect for it succeeding. That concludes my remarks.
Well, thank you all. There have been so many good questions. We will distribute the questions to our panelists. If anyone chooses to respond, we'll see if we can get them back to you. But in the meantime, I was going to ask everybody to applaud, but I'm not sure that anyone would notice on Zoom. So thank you very, very much, and we hope to see you at our next panel. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.